In all the countries in the grip of the Third Reich, from the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union across Europe to France, a campaign of mass deportation and extermination of Jews took place. The Germans conducted a very organized, well-thought-out policy of extermination of the Jewish nation. The first ghetto was established in October 1939 in Piotrków Trybunalski. By 1940, there were already many ghettos, and practically all of them were eradicated following the same plan. Mass executions and other forms of persecution were part of everyday life here in Poland under German occupation. The law was draconian. For example, helping Jews was punishable by death. The Polish authorities in exile didn't make any distinction between Poles and Jews under Hitler's occupation. Both were treated the same, as citizens of the Second Republic of Poland. I ask you to extend all assistance and protection to those being murdered, and at the same time I condemn before all humanity, which has been silent about this for too long, all of these atrocities. No action that could have halted this was taken by any of the world powers. There were suggestions for air raids or bombing even just the roads leading to extermination camps, but nothing of that sort was ever done. Switzerland was an enclave through which one could escape Europe. Here, if somebody obtained documents from a neutral state, then they could get out of Europe by transit from Switzerland. That was the one and only way.
Chciałbym mieć paszport Urugwaju. Ach, jaki to jest piękny kraj. Ach, jak przyjemnie być poddanym kraju, co zwie się Urugwaj. Chciałbym mieć paszport Paragwaju. Złoty i wolny to jest kraj. Ach, jak przyjemnie być poddanym kraju, co zwie się Paragwaj.
Dlaczego tak mało wiemy?
Why do we know so little? Well, for one, it was a clandestine operation. These people didn't brag about what they'd done during the war. Not even Julius Kuhl bragged about it, despite being considered by Jews as the originator of this rescue mission. He didn't talk about it to the end of his life. He knew exactly what it was. It was a group effort. The communist government of the Polish People's Republic didn't really try to preserve the good memory of the diplomacy of the Second Republic. Alexander Ładoś was a minister of the government in exile in France before the French capitulation. He was involved with the People's Party, and when Professor Kot came to France, Ładoś was forced to give way to him in the government. So, he was appointed envoy to Bern. Soon after the arrival of Alexander Ładoś in Bern, the Swiss envoy in Germany was, for the only time during the war, summoned to the foreign ministry in Berlin. Joachim von Ribbentrop explained to him that if Envoy Ładoś was accredited as an envoy plenipotentiary in Switzerland, the German government would recall their envoy. It is not hard to imagine that in May 1940, this must have made a shocking impression on the Swiss. Switzerland was neutral and tried to maintain a balanced diplomatic relationship with Germany. Importantly, Switzerland was in fear of Germany for the duration of the war, because Nazi Germany could have invaded Switzerland at any moment. That wouldn't have been a great military challenge. Of course, Switzerland was doing everything it could to protect itself, but the fear was ever present.
The 1 of 1 of 1940 April 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 1940
Poland was no longer in control of its territory. It had a government and an army, but it was under occupation. Therefore, German diplomacy claimed that Poland had ceased to exist. It demanded that neutral countries stop acknowledging the Republic of Poland. Switzerland did not yield to these demands, and the Polish legation resided in Bern throughout the war.
Aleksander
Ładoś was accredited to the Swiss government in a way which could be described as a circumvention of the law. He was accredited not as an envoy plenipotentiary, but as chargé d'affaires, the person in charge of the legation. Ładoś's situation changed very quickly. Because only a few weeks after he'd been appointed, France was defeated, and almost the entire Polish 2nd Rifle Division crossed the Swiss border. These troops had fought in the Battle of France in 1940, and almost all of them managed to cross the Franco-Swiss border into Switzerland, where they were interned. This was over 13,000 soldiers. He managed to convince the Swiss government that Polish troops crossing the border were not the French army, but soldiers of an allied army. Consequently, they were not subject to enforced return, but were only interned instead. He was there when the last units of the Polish army crossed the border, including the staff of General Prugar-Kettling. Poland had a consular section located at Turnstrasse. Consul Konstanty Rokicki worked there. There too, according to one biographer, resided Juliusz Kühl, who didn't have a formal diplomatic status. In fact, he was actually employed as deputy head of the consular section of the legation of the Republic of Poland. One of the most important contacts Juliusz Kühl and later Representative Ładoś had was the Sternbuch family. This was a very wealthy and influential family living near Lake Geneva. Recha Sternbuch, wife of the head of the family, was the daughter of the rabbi of Antwerp and had a wealth of contacts all over Europe.
Chciałbym mieć paszport Kostaryki, nieba seledyn wieczny maj. Ach, jak przyjemnie móc powiedzieć, że Kostaryka to mój kraj. Chciałbym mieć paszport boliwijski, jak przyjaciele moi dwaj. Boliwia, wonna kraina, ach, jaki to jest piękny kraj.
These are the embassy's guest rooms. This is currently the section for guests, but back in those days, this was actually the entrance to the whole building.
Jakob Kumoch was the first ambassador who was interested in the story. At first, he did not believe me, but he asked, hey, bring me more proof. I need more information. Can you get me? So I delivered him more. Then he said, oh, I support you. We have to bring this to the knowledge because it's not known in Poland.
Among other things, we have the testimony of Juliusz Kühl, who explicitly states that consultations on how to help our fellow citizens began at the legation at the turn of 1939 and 1940. We know that a member of an influential Jewish family living in Switzerland managed to get a Paraguayan passport for his fiancée, who was residing in the Warsaw ghetto.
Która przebywała w getcie warszawskim.
So my father was basically alone in the ghetto. His life was saved by this friend of his, Guta Sternbuch, then Guta Eisenzweig. And the way it was saved was that Guta had met a man before the war, a Jewish businessman named Eli Sternbuch, who had come to Poland on a business trip. Eli Sternbuch, over the course of the war, tried very hard to save Gutta's life, despite the fact that they had only met once, and there was no commitment on her part to marry him. And Gutta Sternbuch was the first person to get one of these Paraguayan passports. So Gutta was sent a passport and wrote back to Eli to thank him and ask for 2 more for her parents. Her father was no longer in the ghetto by the time the passports came. I think he'd been deported. So she gave one of the passports. My father basically got the passport of Gutta's father.
The passport for Gutta and her family certainly wasn't the first. From the spring of 1941, the Polish embassy was using Paraguayan passports to rescue Jews from lands occupied by the Soviets. Julius Kühl's testimony suggests that approximately 30 people were saved in this way. Bern, May 1941, to Mr. Weingott in Lvov. Dear Mr. Weingott, in a separate letter you will receive a passport on the basis of which you can get to Paraguay through Japan. Therefore, you need to get a transit visa to Japan and go to Kobe. Please confirm via telegraph that you have received the document. I wish you a pleasant journey. Yours faithfully, Hügli, Consul. The operation of producing passports in Bern involved several South American countries. In the case of the Polish legation, Paraguay played the main role. Why Paraguay? Because Paraguay only had an honorary consul here. He was Swiss and had nothing to do with Paraguay. For money, large sums of money, this person sold blank passports. The Polish legation approached him with an offer, or rather a request for help in issuing passports. He would meet with one of the legation employees, usually Julius Kühl, but one of the documents indicates that at least once Envoy Ładoś's deputy, Stefan Jan Ryniewicz, met with him as well. They picked up blank passports, which were then delivered to either the Polish consular office in Turmstrasse, here in Bern, or to the legation. The person who filled in most of these documents was Consul Konstanty Rokicki. Blank passports were, of course, not all it took. Information was needed about the people who were to be rescued. At least 2 outstanding men cooperating with the Polish legation helped with this, both Jews, both with connections to Poland. One of them was Abraham Silberschein, who had come to Switzerland just before the war broke out. In September 1939, as the representative of the World Jewish Congress, he founded an organization to help Jewish people during the war, Reliko. The second man was Chaim Eis, co-founder and Swiss leader of an ultra-Orthodox Jewish organization, Agudath Israel, which had been operating as a political party not only in Poland but also in the United States since the 1930s. They both used their contacts to obtain the personal data necessary to issue passports, and then made lists of names, which they then delivered to the Polish legation in Bern. Chaim Eis admitted that the rescue of prominent members of the Jewish community took priority over others. Saving them was meant to help rebuild Jewish elites after the war. The price of one passport was 500 Swiss francs. Some of the money came from Chaim Eis, who conducted a fundraising campaign himself.
It was financed by the World Jewry. But Jews, I believe, also by Polish government.
To the Polish legation in Bern, Receptus 790, June 1942. The Ministry of Social Welfare requests information whether medicines from list number 1 have been purchased and sent to the country, and what is the price. As for medicines from the list number 2, we reach out to America and will inform you of the results. Money transfers from New York didn't specify either the beneficiary or the sender, but I presume that some of the money could have come from the national budget designated for refugee care. To the Polish legation in Bern, September 1942, Receptus 171, the Ministry of Social Welfare requests information regarding how much of the sum of $200,000 has been spent so far. Are more funds needed for the further purchases of pharmaceuticals? After filling out the passport, putting down all the information previously provided, and adding the photograph, the passports went back to the Honorary Consul of Paraguay in Bern, Rudolf Hügli, who authenticated them with his signature. You can see that the passport is filled in handwriting which is different to the consul's signature, as well as the word he always added, consul. This made the document less credible, but nobody paid attention to that in those days. We're only paying attention to it now. Consul Hügli was a Swiss notary, and some of the passports were simply smuggled into the general government and also owing to bribes which were paid to German officials. Some of them ended up in Consul Hügli's drawer. He would then send authenticated copies to Poland. Dear Mr. Grössner, I have the honor to inform you that, as the result of the efforts of your relatives, you have been granted citizenship of Paraguay. We request that you send us 2 photographs and personal information immediately so that your passport can be issued. Kind regards, Hügli, Consul.
That means with this letter, they had an official document to show to Germans, hey, I have a citizenship. I will get the passport, but I had to send pictures.
Mr. David Guzik and family, Warsaw. Mrs. Rosa Gottlieb and family, Opole. Mr. and Mrs. Kalman Blachas, Będzin. Mrs. Berta Jachman and family, Warsaw. Mrs. Mindla Bick and family, Warsaw. Mr. Salomon Kalnicki, Warsaw. Mr. Leon Rotfeld and family, Przemyślane.
In other cases, there are letters to recipients with the same text that they have become Paraguay citizen, and a passport is ready to be picked up. And at the same time, there was an attachment of a photocopy of such a passport, legalized by a Swiss notary.
It must be remembered that then a passport, at least a Paraguayan passport, was not just a passport for one person, but for the whole family. Many times people completely unrelated to the beneficiary were added. It was a passport issued to a name, along with the wife, the children, mother and father. This is why the number of people who could leave on one passport was immeasurably greater than would be possible today. In the middle of 1943, when the passport initiative gained momentum, consuls from other South American countries joined in. Passports of El Salvador, Peru, Honduras, Haiti, and others were being issued. Switzerland was incredibly important to spies from all countries, both the Allies and the Germans. Mr. Chaim Eiss was infiltrated by a German agent. Fortunately, the spy was discovered, but the Germans had already found out about everything.
Oui, les Allemands ont été au courant, bien sûr, de cette affaire, malheureusement.
The Germans were convinced, like everyone else, that the Jews themselves, the Jewish organizations, were fabricating passports all along. Perhaps they didn't even realize that the passports were genuine. They were illegally issued, but genuine. The Swiss police managed to briefly detain some representatives of these Jewish organizations, but they realized that something was missing. They didn't have the blank passports. This was probably the first clue that there was a third party involved. That's when the Swiss police, from interrogations and surveillance, learned that the Paraguayan passports were being produced in the Polish consular office. One of very interesting document is the transcript of a conversation between Alexander Ładoś and the Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcel Pile-Golas, wherein the matter came to a head with the Swiss accusing the Pole that the legation is participating in the process of creating documents. Envoy Ładoś energetically defended Abraham Silberstein and others. He explained that the operation was about saving people's lives, and that in such a case, breaking some minor regulations, producing documents which would never be used on Swiss territory, was of no consequence to Switzerland, and in no way compromised its security. We only ask for you to turn a blind eye, because were this operation uncovered, it would seriously damage your reputation. After this confrontation, the Swiss just silently acknowledged what had been going on in a consular office, and Polish diplomats didn't suffer any further consequences. Even though they could have resulted differently, as they did in the case of Consul Hügli, whose exequatur, his authority to act as a consul, was withdrawn.
Egzekwator, czyli możliwość czy uprawnienie do wykonywania funkcji konsula.
La Suisse a eu une attitude extrêmement fermée et négative.
Switzerland adopted a strict attitude towards the flow of Jewish people crossing its border with German-occupied France.
La France occupée et avec l'Allemagne. Par contre,
on the other hand, they were more open to Jews coming from those parts of France not occupied by the Germans, but who were not from Vichy. In short, they feared persecution.
La peur était là.
Switzerland took in a large number of refugees, military and civilians. Of the civilians, approximately 22,000 were Jews, and approximately 7,000 to 8,000 of whom remained in Switzerland for the duration of the war.
Dans la guerre, il y en avait encore environ 7-8 000 qui étaient restés d'avant la guerre.
Alexander Ładoś allowed the Sternbuch family access to Polish ciphers. Access in the sense that whatever they wrote would be translated to Polish and sent encrypted to the General Consulate in New York, to a part of the leaders of the Jewish community there.
So everybody was informed. I mean, Roosevelt was informed. Everybody was informed about the Holocaust. Yeah, there were cables from Sternbuch to rabbis. And those rabbis tried also to influence the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. But Franklin Roosevelt was very passive, not cooperating in saving the Jews or bombing Auschwitz. And that's a separate chapter.
Now, what was the hope of the Jews after being constantly attacked and tortured by the Germans, taken forcefully to labor, robbed from their monies, robbed from their possessions? What was the hope? The hope was that England will finally, England and France, and here France was already defeated, and England and London was on fire. What was their hope? Their hope was gone.
Chciałbym mieć paszport Hondurasu. Honduras brzmi jak wschodni raj. Przyjemnie rzucić od czasu do czasu. Honduras właśnie to mój kraj. Chciałbym mieć paszport Urugwaju, mieć Kostarykę, mieć Paragwaj.
A person in possession of such a passport or a confirmation of such a passport was, in the eyes of German occupants, treated as a foreigner to whom occupation regulations could not apply. This is why a significant part of these passport holders was not sent to death camps, but were only interned as presumed citizens of neutral states. Those with a Paraguayan passport were sent to Vittel. That's not historically true. Some people were also interned in Bergen-Belsen, and there were other places where passport holders were interned. When the Germans entered into a state of war with the United States, a concept was devised where these citizens, or rather passport holders of South American countries, be used as some kind of trump card.
Posiadaczy paszportów południowoamerykańskich traktować jako swego rodzaju as w rękawie. Niemieckie władze
German authorities held the assumption that there were German citizens residing in both Americas who would most certainly be interned. In such a case, the people holding South American passports could be used as a type of insurance for those German citizens.
These 3 Paraguayan passports landed them first in the Paviak and then sent from the Paviak with other people who had these allied passports of various sorts to Vittel. And he's sitting in a train car with other Hasidic Jews who have passports from Uruguay. And they're sitting in a nice, this isn't a cattle car. These are people who are being transported from the ghetto, you can imagine what that is, in January of 1943, in seats, nice, I don't know if it was first class or second class, nice seats. And one of the Hasidim says to the other, so what if they ask us where Uruguay is and what language they speak in Uruguay? And the other Hasid says, yeah, what's the question? In Uruguay, they speak Uruguayish. That was the conversation that they had. And my father said, no, I tell them it's probably Spanish and it's in South America. And he said, then I thought, I looked at us. Here we are, Jewish people. We come from an ancient religion. We trace our roots back to Abraham, who founded the concept of monotheism. We gave the world the great religious ideas, and we're nobody. We're treated like garbage because we don't have a passport. In Uruguayan, what did they give? Not to say anything against the Uruguayans, what did they give the world? Bananas. And their lives are saved because they have that passport. Until we Jews get a passport that says the land of Israel, ours, we will be treated as if we are garbage instead of the aristocratic contributors to world civilization that we are.
Mam okno na tamtą stronę, bezczelne żydowskie okno. Na piękny park Krasińskiego, gdzie liście jesienne mokną. A mnie nie wolno, a mnie nie wolno, a mnie nie wolno, nie wolno, nie wolno, a mnie w oknie stanąć nie wolno. A mnie nie wolno, a mnie nie wolno, a mnie nie wolno, nie wolno, nie wolno, a mnie w oknie stanąć nie wolno. A mnie nie wolno, a mnie nie wolno, a mnie nie wolno, nie wolno, nie wolno, a mnie w oknie stanąć nie wolno.
finally there were brave Jews who said, at least, let's die like heroes. But this was not, for the majority of the Jews, this was not the Jewish way. Of course we should resist, and of course we should not let them do it. But the question is, were we strong enough? Of course we were not.
At a certain point, Ładoś gets a message, a dispatch from London. It is dated May 1943. This was while the ghetto uprising was taking place. Confidential. The ministry has recently been informed by the Jewish organizations that there is a way to individually rescue Jews from being murdered by Germans through issuing South American passports for them. Motivations of a strictly humanitarian nature oblige us to engage in matters of this sort as far as is possible. And this fragment we now understand as a permission. You are permitted, Mr. Envoy, to act as you see fit. Envoy Ładoś writes as follows, and this in a dispatch addressed to the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in exile. Bern, 4th January 1944, confidential. The subject of obtaining South American passports for Polish Jews in order to save them was current in May of last year. Many people have been saved this way and directed to internment camps. Unfortunately, in the meantime, serious complications have arisen in this matter, which have caused not only a halt to the issue of new passports, but the validity of passports already issued to be questioned. In these circumstances, it has become absolutely impossible to obtain new passports. At present, our only concern is to save the people who are already in internment camps. Alexander Ładoś, Envoy of Poland. And this is when another epic struggle begins, a fight against time to convince Paraguay to recognize the passports that were issued to its alleged citizens. Encrypted telegram to Buenos Aires, Santiago, Lima, Bogotá, Mexico City, Havana, Washington, the Vatican. The Polish envoy in Bern advises that the German authorities have decreed that on the 20th of March, they will begin the deportation of Jews, holders of South American passports thus far interned in Vittel. The lives of these people can only be saved by official statements from the South American countries. The United States legation in Bern have requested their government to intervene. To the Vatican, I beg the ambassador to request that the Secretary of State issue instructions to the Apostolic Nunciature in Latin America. To all, please advise us of the results of the intervention. Romer. A démarche regarding the acknowledgement of the passports was conducted jointly with the American envoy and the local apostolic nunciature. Thus, Vatican diplomacy became one of the key players, not just in Bern, where Nuncio Filippo Bernardini gave a great deal of assistance to Envoy Ładoś, but all over the world, in this case, South American capitals in particular. Nuncio Bernardini had a good relationship with Ambassador Ładoś and allowed him to use diplomatic couriers. The German authorities, realizing that there were far too many South American citizens residing in Poland and held in internment camps, decided to call the bluff. And they did so by confronting the capital cities of South America with the number of passports from their countries found on people residing in the territory of the general government. Why did Paraguayan passports play such a role? Because in the end, Paraguay was one of those countries that acknowledged its citizens.
Zeidman wrote many letters from Vittel. I think he spent almost his whole time in Vittel writing letters, trying to save Jews who were still in the Warsaw Ghetto. He had written many letters to ICE. ICE was a Jew in Switzerland who was involved with saving many Jews. Russian princess in Vittel named Sofka Skipwith. She was there as a British citizen, and she smuggled out the names of all the Jews in Vittel. She wrote microscopically on cigarette papers and smuggled them out. All the names of the Polish Jews in Vittel.
And actually, of the hundreds of Jews that were in this camp, only 12 survived. And my father was one of those 12 Jews who survived within Vittel. And they survived partly by avoiding these transports by hiding within Vittel in various ways, including hiding within an oven for a few days during one of the transports. And so my father was in Vittel, managed to evade all these deportations. I think there were 2 or 3. Gutta persuaded not just my father and her mother, but a few other people to hide inside an oven that was still hot from the day's baking. It was a big hotel oven, and there were 10 of people maybe inside that oven, which was still very, very hot. They hid inside that oven while the Jews were taken out of the camp. The Jews who had resisted, the Jews were being taken away, were shot and put in a pile. When the camp was liberated, these Jews came out of hiding. My father was among these Jews. Gutta married Ellie Sternbuch, who had saved all their lives. She had 7 children. My father married my mother, and they moved to America after they spent 2 years in Israel, but basically raised their children within the Orthodox community of Borough Park in Brooklyn in New York.
The liquidation of the Vittel camp was one of the greatest tragedies of the passport operation. However, according to estimates of historians, at least 400 people were saved, and this number is probably far greater.
But in the end phase, the Germans, the Gestapo or SS, they made money out of these passports. Because the recipients of those passports, they were already deported and murdered in Auschwitz. And there starts the Polski affair. Wealthy Jews who were able to escape from the ghetto to the Aryan side, and they were hiding. But the Gestapo wanted to catch them. So they said, listen, we have South American passports. You can get them in the Hotel Polski. You have to pay money. So those people who had the money from the Germans, the South American passports, say, yeah, you're going to be transferred to Pawiak prison, and then you go to Vittel, but you will not be deported to Auschwitz or Treblinka. Okay, when the people were taken out, they were shot.
Polish diplomacy had nothing to do with the Hotel Polski scandal. Perhaps passports illegally obtained by Germans were used, but those two things cannot be connected. It was the Germans who, upon discovering that there were passports in the ghetto, orchestrated this action. But the fact that there were passports in the ghetto was a Polish accomplishment, meant to save Jews, and not some anti-Semitic initiative.
Po to, by mieszkać spokojnie w Warszawie. Po to, by mieszkać spokojnie w Warszawie. Po to, by mieszkać spokojnie w Warszawie. To jednak najpiękniejszy kraj.
The 4 Polish diplomats experienced very different fortunes. Very soon after these events, the two great Jewish collaborators passed away very quickly. Chaim Eist died during the war of a heart attack in 1943. Abraham Silberschein died in 1951 in Geneva. In 1945, Ładoś, who was still Polish envoy, elected to support the provisional communist government in Poland. This was completely in keeping with his political views. These views were completely, as he would say, realistic in those times. His final act as envoy was to hand the keys of the embassy over to the representative of the provisional communist government, Rudolf Przeswański, in July of 1945.
Tymczasowego rządu jedności narodowej Rudolfowi Przeswańskiemu.
After relinquishing the legation in Bern to the Warsaw authorities, Ładoś moved to France, where he served as a representative of Mikołajczyk's Polish People's Party in Western Europe. Towards the end of the 1940s, he withdrew from public life. Later, towards the end of the 1950s, he was contacted by the Polish Communist Secret Service on an operation codenamed Nielot. Ultimately, in 1960, Ładoś returned to Poland and focused on writing his memoirs. He died in 1963. Julius Kuhl also left Switzerland and moved to Canada. He spent the final years of his life in the United States, and he died in Florida in 1985. The fate of Stefan Jan Ryniewicz is more complicated because he emigrated to Argentina, operated between Argentina and the United States after a short stay in France. The last news of him was when he was presented with the Order of Polonia Restituta by the President of the Republic of Poland in exile in December 1972. Konstanty Rokicki, the man who counterfeited the passports, remained in Switzerland. We know that he died in Lucerne in 1958. For 60 years, the authorities in Lucerne were unaware that a person who certainly deserved the title of righteous among nations had died there. Suffice to say that Consul Rokicki's grave was removed 20 years after his death towards the end of the 1970s. Polish diplomats, with the fullest awareness of their responsibility, fulfilled the mission of their state, initially striving to rescue the largest number of Polish citizens, but later, of course, passports were issued for Jews from other countries. This was about saving lives, about the great mission of humanism. This operation was also supported by the Polish underground state, by the Polish government in London, and also by the Holy See, which ensured that Paraguay did not question these passports. The fact is that at least several hundred were saved, whose descendants are with us today, for which we express great thanks. Thank you for paying this symbolic tribute to Polish diplomats, heroes in the struggle for life of every man. Thank you.
Thank you once again. Thank you for your presence here today, and thank you for paying this symbolic tribute to the Polish diplomats, to the heroes of struggle for life of every man. Thank you very much.
Well, in hindsight of today, who helped the Jews in the Second World War? There were not many countries. We have Denmark, they saved the Jews. We have some Italy, who also saved the Jews. Some the Vatican, small, but Vatican. And also the Swiss helped. They let Jews in. But at the same time, they refused many Jews, including my grandparents, who disappeared in the Holocaust. But the Poles helped the most. I mean, the Polish state couldn't do more. First of all, the Polish state didn't have a territory. It was occupied. So the diplomats and the Polish government in exile, they did what they could.
Most of the passports created by Consul Rokicki were not passports for Polish citizens. They were passports for Dutch citizens, for citizens of pre-Hitler Germany. The paradox of Rokicki and Ładoś is that Poland saved more than 100 citizens of Germany from extermination. These diplomats should be honored in Germany. According to our knowledge, there were more citizens of pre-war Germany saved than there were Polish citizens.
My parents were born in Germany, and they escaped Germany, thinking that they could escape the war and move to Holland. We always knew that my parents had Paraguayan passports, and even though my mother gave interviews to Steven Spielberg, my father wrote a book, my twin brother, who unfortunately couldn't be here, teaches the Holocaust. We never were able to really know, how did we get these passports? Did they help? What were they all about? But it was always something that we wondered about.
I had a Paraguayan passport, and I think that saved my life, because I was then transported to Bergen-Belsen, and otherwise I should ended up in another extermination concentration camp. Well, the persons who took me in Holland afterwards, after the war, they were also saved because of this passport.
My mother had an uncle in Zurich, and he was probably from the ICE group, and he was the one who took care of a Paraguayan passport for them and for the rest of the family. But for the rest of the family, it came too late. They were deported to Sobibor and did not survive. But my parents, due to the fact that they were registered as Paraguayan, they did not have physically the passport, but they had a document that they had a Paraguayan nationality. And it's a really original, because the pictures are original. And we only got this last Friday. It was with the ICE, with descendants of the ICE family.
My father was receiving, living in Montreux, Switzerland. He was receiving up to 100 letters a day from people all over Poland to ask him to send them this medicine. They would never say a passport. Yeah? The medicine that helped your aunt, we needed it too. Yeah?
I myself met the Minister of Agriculture from Paraguay, and I told him, thank you very much for saving our lives. But eventually we didn't thank the right person, because in this occasion you can see that those who really saved, it was Mr. Rokicki and his staff, and we owe them our lives.
Tan is the biggest one. Yaron is sandwich, in Hebrew is chocolate, and he's the youngest one. And all knows the story about us.
I'm Uti Meir, the daughter of Hannah Pick Goslar, that got the Paraguayan passport. And this is the third generation, Rafi Meir and Orit Brown. They are my children. I have some more 6 children. And some 20 plus grandchildren. So my mother has 20 plus great-grandchildren. And Rokicki, we want to thank Mr. Rokicki for what he has done to the world.
And to us.
And to mankind. I think for mankind. He is a hero.
The Agudat Israel World Organization writes as follows. Dear Mr. Lax, our Swiss branch organization have written to inform us of the very effective assistance and rescue work, this can be understood as efforts to save lives, which your colleagues in Bern, Councillor of Legation Reniewicz, Dr. Julius Kuhl, refugee attaché, Polish minister Aleksander Ładoś, consul Rokicki have rendered.
Dr Juliusz Kuhl, polski minister Aleksander Ładoś, konsul Rokicki.
Without their cooperation, this work, which has been the means of rescuing many hundreds of Polish Jews, would not have been achieved. This telegram was sent in January 1945, so just after the Holocaust had ended. This is not a purely Polish story, nor a purely Jewish one. This is a Polish-Jewish story. Neither would have accomplished anything without the other. The grave of Konstanty Rokicki in Lucerne was found thanks to the efforts of the Institute of National Remembrance, the Polish Embassy in Bern, the authorities of the city of Lucerne, and the Swiss Foreign Affairs Ministry. During the making of this film, Consul Markus Blechner and Professor Ruth Fivaz were unaware that their fathers had co-financed the passport operation.
Chciałbym mieć paszport Hondurasu. Honduras brzmi jak wschodni raj. Przyjemnie rzucić od czasu do czasu. Honduras właśnie to mój kraj. Chciałbym mieć paszport Urugwaju, mieć Kostarika, mieć Paragwaj. Po to, by mieszkać spokojnie w Warszawie. Po to, by mieszkać spokojnie w Warszawie. Po to, by mieszkać spokojnie w Warszawie. To jednak najpiękniejszy kraj.